Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Grattan Institute webinar on our latest report, It All Adds Up, Reforming Points-Tested Visas. My name is Trent Wiltshire. I'm the Deputy Program Director, Migration and Labour Markets here at Grattan, and joining me is Natasha Bradshaw, a co-author on the report and a Senior Associate at Grattan Institute.
Hello.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're presenting from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to thank the Scanlon Foundation for their generous contribution that has made Grattan's migration work possible. So our report looks at points-tested visas, as the name suggests, and today we'll be covering sort of four areas. First, I'll start a bit of an overview of the permanent migration program and looking at how the points-tested visas fit within that. Tash will then talk about how we intend to reform points-tested visas. Then I'll look at state and territory visas, and finally the economic benefits we predict will happen from our proposed reforms. And then after that, we've got a few questions to cover, so thank you for those. So firstly, Australia runs a substantial permanent migration program. So 2/3 of all visas issued are via the skill stream. So you can see there in the chart that the skill stream, the yellow bars, makes up a large share of our permanent migration program. We also have family visas and a large humanitarian program as well. So in the coming year, will be about 200,000 permanent visas will be issued. Within this skill stream, we have a few different types of skilled visas. So there's employer nominated, we have global talent, a small number of business innovation investment visas, and then 3 visas which we're focused on today that use the points test to select migrants. That's the state visa there in the orange, the regional visa, and the skilled independent in the dark orange. So these visas make up almost 2/3 of visas being issued this year and next financial year. So this report dives into points-tested visas, and it's important because so many of our skilled visas are issued by the points test. So getting it right really makes a big difference. And it matters so much because skilled migration is a really huge economic contributor to Australia. Getting it right offers big long-term payoffs. So this chart shows the lifetime fiscal impact per person by different skilled visa subclasses. So this is some Australian Treasury research from a couple of years ago. So it shows there that the net fiscal impact of different visa classes is really large and positive. So for independent skilled visas, fiscal impact is about $390,000 in dollars a few years ago. State and regional visas are about $280,000. Overall, in today's dollars, the average skilled migrant provides a fiscal boost of about $250,000. Multiplying that by the large number of skilled visas we do offer, so 137,000, gives a $34 billion fiscal dividend for each cohort over their lifetime. So that's about a 1.3% of GDP. So it's really big. It's really important to get this right in terms of our skilled migration policy. So our report feeds into the government's migration strategy, which was released last December. And this strategy had a real focus on the selection of permanent skilled migrants, which is something Grattan has talked a lot about. I've just got a quote here from the strategy that sort of aligns with our view in terms of how we should be selecting permanent skilled migrants. So we should be focusing on the factors that best contribute to lifting Australia's long-term economic productivity and workforce participation. I'll leave it there and we'll get into Tasha's work on how to actually design a points test.
So in this section, I'm going to go through how we think we should redesign the points test. As Trent said, there are limited points visas on offer each year. And so this is aimed at selecting the most skilled migrants to offer those visas to. And there are 3 key things here. First, we show that the core points in the test should be recalibrated so that points are given for characteristics that correlate with high long-term earnings. Second, we should get rid of unnecessary points that are leaving migrants in limbo. And third, we should broaden the number of eligible occupations. So you get an idea. This is what the point test looks like today. So there are points for age, English, work experience, your occupation, your level of education, and then there are a series of bonus points for Australian study and professional year, and community language. You also get points if a state chooses to nominate you, and for having a skilled partner or for being a single applicant. The first thing we do is look at calibrating the points test to select for migrants that are most likely to make the largest economic contribution to Australia over their lifetime. The measure that we use here is expected lifetime earnings. Of course, that's not a perfect measure. We do have things like structural underpayment in certain industries, and we're not accounting for things like unpaid work in this measure. But it is the best measure we have, and it's quite good for a number of reasons. First, high earnings are a good proxy for human capital and for having skills that are in demand by employers in the Australian labour market. All else equal, higher earners will pay more in taxes and require less government services, and so they create a larger fiscal dividend. And it's also a signal that migrants are participating fully in social and economic life. Now, previous analysis, including that which was used in the last major change to the points test in 2011, relied on analysis of short-term outcomes for determining which factors should be given points. But it can take a long time for migrants to settle in Australia, have their skills recognised, and find a good job. So what we do in this report is to use PLIDA data to analyse which characteristics of migrants predict high long-run earnings. So this is a data set that includes all Australian migrants, and we're able to link their visa data, including their history of temporary visas, with income tax returns over time and also the census. And what we show with this work is that the four most important things for predicting migrants' long-run earnings are occupation skill level, education, English proficiency, and previous earnings in Australia. And as you can see in this chart, these things matter a lot for their long-run earnings. One thing we're very conscious of in designing the points test is that we don't want to bake in any existing discrimination in the Australian labour market. And so we include controls in these regressions for country of birth as well as gender. And we also weight down the English language points when we offer our design of a new points test. And that's partly because of discrimination and partly because there are some problems with the way that IELTS scores work. But essentially what we do is use the results from these regressions to propose the relativities between points in the redesigned point. Now, in addition to improving the calibration of these core points, there are also other flaws with the current points test, which mean we're not selecting the most skilled applicants. So the first thing is that there are insufficient points being offered for the most important characteristics. So that's age, English language, education, and skilled work experience. And instead, there are a range of points being offered for things that we don't think are as important. One of these is that points are offered for really long periods of work experience, including up to 8 years of experience in Australia. And this rewards points for people that have spent a long time here rather than people that have, really high quality work experience, even if that's for a shorter duration. And so what we'd like to do instead is to offer points for a shorter period of work experience, but where that experience has attracted a high wage in Australia. We also think there are insufficient points currently for spouse skills. So spouses make up a big part of the intake. And so we think their skills should be taken more into account in the selection process. We also think that points for age are not currently granular enough. So the chart on the right of this slide shows Australia's age points versus Canada's. And just arriving in Australia a few years early makes quite a big difference to someone's lifetime earnings here. And so having that granularity rewards people that come younger. Finally, there are bonus points being offered for things like studying at an Australian university or a regional university or completing a professional year that we don't think are a good way of predicting whether migrants are likely to be successful in Australia. So one example of this is that we give points for having studied in Australia, but actually our analysis shows that migrants who studied in Australia don't earn more and in fact earn less than other skilled migrants. It's likely that part of this is because they get these bonus points for Australian and regional study, which means they need to meet lower requirements on other parts of the points test in order to be offered a visa. So with that in mind, this slide shows our new proposed point test. So the main changes we're proposing, so as I mentioned already, are more granular points for age. We're going to increase the share of points going to English language skills, which reflects their very high impact on long-run earnings. We're also going to introduce greater jumps between points for different levels of education, so a higher reward for higher levels of education. We'd like to allocate points for broader skill level experience rather than experience in very specific occupations, so points for skill level 1 or skill level 2 occupations more broadly. When it comes to experience, we'd like to offer points just for a minimum of 2 years experience in any high-skilled job, and additional points for people that have worked in Australia and attracted a high wage. This allows us to use information from employers. So if an Australian employer is willing to hire someone and offer them a good wage in Australia, that tells us a lot about the likely success that person will have in Australia's labour market going forward. We've also increased the weighting for partner skills, as I mentioned earlier, and single applicants get the maximum of those points. Now, the total points test will be up to 500 points available, and potential applicants will need to score 300 points in order to be able to submit an expression of interest for a visa. Now, the final problem with the current point test is that you can only apply if you're qualified to work in an occupation that's deemed to be in shortage, so on the medium and long-term skills list. But there are more than 200 high-skilled occupations which are left off this list. And that means we're losing a lot of prospective high-skilled migrants that aren't even eligible to apply, which is a lot of talent we're potentially missing out on. We also know that migrants often do not stay in the occupation they nominate when they come to Australia. So this chart's showing for different visa streams, the share of people that stay in the occupation they nominate, the share that move to another high skill occupation, or who change to a lower skill occupation. And as you can see, only about half of people work in the occupation they nominated when they first arrive in Australia, and that share declines the longer that people are here. And often that just means they're using their skills in a different way. So accountants are one of the biggest occupations where few people actually work in the nominated occupation. But often what we see is them taking senior roles in finance, in consulting or marketing. And so they're still using their skills just in a slightly different way. So we don't think you need to be quite as prescriptive about very specific occupations. We also find that in general, people who come here with a high-skilled occupation, even if they work outside that occupation, they tend to do pretty well anyway. So, for example, here we can see accountants. A lot of people work outside their nominated occupation, even many working below their nominated skill level, often in roles like bookkeeping. But they typically still earn more than $100,000 a year. So they're still doing very well in Australia, even if they're working in a slightly different role. So what we propose is, instead of having these very specific occupation lists, is that we expand the range of occupations to all skill level 1, 2, and 3 occupations. So those are the 3 highest skill levels. This would require the government to create skills assessments for some occupations that aren't currently on any occupation list, but it's not too many, and we think that's an achievable thing. One problem with retaining skills assessments is that the occupations aren't updated rapidly. So when you have sort of frontier industries with different occupations, you may miss out on some of those people, but that's not a problem we're able to solve really in the short term. So I'm going to pass back to Trent to talk about some of the different types of visas.
Thanks, Tash. So now I'm going to talk about 2 other types of point-tested visas, the state and regional visas, and our recommendation for these visas is actually to abolish the visas and to allocate more to the independent point-tested visa that Tash just spoke about then. So I showed this chart earlier, but just wanted to bring it up again just to highlight how important state and regional visas are. They make up about half the share of all skilled visas for this financial year and next financial year. So it's a big part of the program. It's important we get it right, but we think that from our analysis, visa holders on these visas typically don't earn as much and do as well as other visas. So that's why we recommend that these visas be abolished. So state and regional visas have a few characteristics that are important that I'll just run through quickly. Most importantly, they require a nomination from a state or territory government to be eligible. State and territory governments can nominate for the 190 state visa or the 491 regional visa. This regional visa, really critically, it's a provisional visa, so the person is required to live outside of Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane for at least 3 years while holding this visa. So state and territory governments can choose migrants however they wish, as long as the migrant or the applicant earns 65 points or more on the points test. They're not bound by the rankings of the points once that person reaches 65. And states use their visas to meet multiple objectives, such as supporting regions or universities, to staff essential services, and to support sort of industry policy objectives. Importantly, state and regional visa holders are given bonus points for nomination by a state or territory, 5 points for the state visa, 15 points for the regional visa, and this boosts their ranking, so they can score less on other parts of the points test, but use these sort of bonus points to get selected for a visa. So the outcomes in terms of points scored show us that regional visa holders typically score less, and a lot higher proportion score 65 points or less compared to independent and state visa holders. So that's sort of one element in terms of not performing as well. Another element is that the earnings of particularly regional visa holders are much lower than other visa holders. This shows by age group, median income across different visa classes. You can see the dark purple and the brown. The regional visas, their median earnings are much lower than the state visa holder in the red, and then independent and employer-sponsored visas in the orange, which are typically much higher. So earnings are much lower. They actually grow much more slowly as well. So this chart tracks income growth over time and shows the average annual growth rate for a regional visa holder is about 4% compared to 9% for a state visa holder, and independent around 7%. So much lower. So why do the regional and state visa holders do worse? Well, typically state and territory governments select lower skilled people. But the really important reason, number two there, is regional visa means that a lot of these regional visa holders can't move to the place they want to and get the job they want. So a high proportion cite the fact they can't move as being the factor behind them stopping them getting a good job. The regional visa restrictions also mean that the most skilled migrants who can score a lot of points don't want to get the regional visa if they can avoid it. And state and regional visa holders also have a broader occupation list to choose from, so they can work in lower skilled jobs. So the outcomes typically mean, earnings are lower for state and regional visa holders. It also holds for people living outside of Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, where state and regional visa holders still earn less, even when accounting for the fact that they're outside the major cities. But it's not just the primary visa holders, it's also the families. So these charts show outcomes for secondary visa holders, mainly spouses of the primary visa holder. The regional visa holders typically have worse family outcomes. Spouses typically are more likely to work in a lower skilled job and earn less as well. So we think the regional visa is bad for a number of reasons, but it affects not just the person, the spouse as well. Now, I mentioned before that states often use these visas to meet essential workforce needs. They are sort of over-allocated to particularly the healthcare sector. So that was a concern. If we did abolish these state and regional visas, would it affect our hospitals and schools' ability to staff and meet essential workforce needs? So looked at the data, and looking at the share of the workforce by different visa classes, actually the state and regional visas make up a tiny share of the total workforce. So we don't think it's that much of a problem. We also propose that states use employer sponsorship more, and that includes perhaps the federal government waiving fees to allow states to sponsor employers more directly. We think that's a better way that states can meet their workforce needs rather than using the regional state visa. So finally, what do our reforms mean? Well, we think it's big economic payoffs. I think that the fiscal dividend from abolishing from reforming the points test will be $84 billion. Reallocating these visas away from state and regional visas to the points test is another $87 billion. So a total of $170 billion fiscal dividend to governments over the next 30 years in today's dollars. So a massive economic dividend from these reforms. On top of that, we think there's going to be productivity spillovers as well. So this is sort of the narrowest economic benefit. So I'll leave it there, noting the time. And this is a list of our recommendations. And I'll just run through a couple of the questions that we've got sent through, because we've got a bunch of really good questions. We answered some of them in our presentation. You can also go onto our website and get the briefing pack if you want to look more closely. But just one question from Bruce about whether our changes will mean fewer skilled trades will come in under the reform points test. Well, we did some modelling, and we think maybe a touch less. those skilled tradespeople that are here earning a good wage, still a good chance of getting a visa because we do offer points for earning high wages in Australia. But importantly, currently very few skilled tradespeople actually come through via the points tested visas. So just 7% of independent points visa holders here nominated a technician or trade occupation to obtain their visa. And that compares to 27% of employer sponsored visa holders. So employer sponsorship, that's both temporary and permanent, is going to be the main route that skilled trades come here, not the points test. Another question from Suresh was about processing times and skills assessment. So, whether this deters people and slows down and affects migrants' ability to perform when here. So definitely agree this is a problem. The slow processing times, the cost of going through the skills assessment process definitely would put some applicants off. So we recommend speeding up processing times as the government has committed to for other visas. We also recommend a review of the skills assessment process. Currently very slow, stops a lot of people from maximising their potential, cost money as well. Another reform we recommend on the points test is that guaranteeing invitations will apply if a person scores more than 400 points. So that's the top 5% of EOIs on the current sort of cohort. So that should attract more high skilled people to apply, noting that to submit an EOI for a visa is actually free. So run a bit over time, but thank you very much for joining us. So you can find the full report on the website at www.grattan.edu.au. The briefing pack is also there, and also the chart pack. And if you'd like to support the work of Grattan, you can do so at our website before the financial year ends, and all donations are tax deductible. So thank you for watching.